It was close to midnight on January 4, 1656, and the deck of the Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de las Maravillas was silent. Only the sound of the Caribbean and the wind caressing the sails of that massive vessel could be heard. A vessel that had departed from Cartagena de Indias loaded with one of the most valuable treasures ever to cross the Atlantic. In less than 30 minutes, that silence would become the most absolute chaos. 605 people would lose their lives in the Caribbean waters, and the treasure the Maravillas carried would disappear to the bottom of the ocean, not to be seen in its entirety for more than 3.5 centuries. What the explorers of Allen Exploration found when they were finally able to document the remains of that shipwreck is so extraordinary that it is today exhibited in the Maritime Museum of the Bahamas as testimony to one of the most dramatic and fascinating stories of the age of Spanish galleons. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Let us begin. To understand the magnitude of what sank with the Maravillas that January night of 1656, one must first understand the context of the Spanish fleet system that for more than 2 centuries was the central mechanism of colonial trade between Spain and its American possessions. The Spanish Empire in America extracted from its colonies quantities of silver and gold that had no precedent in the history of the world economy. The mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia and those of Zacatecas in Mexico produced silver in quantities that transformed the global economy of the 16th and 17th centuries, generating inflation in Europe, financing wars on multiple continents, and enriching a class of merchants and officials whose wealth was inconceivable for any previous generation. All that metal, along with Colombian emeralds, Caribbean pearls, exotic dyes, cacao, and the luxury goods the New World produced, had to be transported safely to Spain across an Atlantic infested with pirates, privateers, and enemy fleets belonging to the European powers that sought to wrest from Spain its colonial dominion. The fleet system was the Spanish response to that logistical and security challenge. Instead of sending ships individually, which made them vulnerable to pirate and privateer attacks, Spain organized its galleons into large convoys protected by warships, which departed from American ports on set dates and crossed the Atlantic together until arriving at Seville or Cadiz. This system, which operated with variations for more than 2 centuries, guaranteed relative security against external attacks, but could not protect the galleons from the most unpredictable and in many cases more deadly dangers than pirates. The reefs, the sandbars, the hurricanes, and the navigation errors that lurked in the waters of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. The Nuestra Señora de las Maravillas was in January 1656 one of the most heavily loaded galleons ever to have sailed the Caribbean waters. Its cargo was not just the usual product of the colonial season, but something more exceptional. It carried the silver bounty that had been recovered from the wreck of the Jesus Maria de la Limpia Concepcion, a galleon that had sunk on an Ecuadorian reef and whose cargo had been rescued through diving operations that were in themselves notable technical feats for the era. In other words, the Maravillas did not transport only the wealth of one colonial season, but the accumulated wealth of multiple expeditions, including the salvage of another previous shipwreck. It was one of the most valuable ships that had ever sailed the Caribbean, and its final destination would be the bottom of the ocean off the coasts of the Bahamas. The collision that sank the Maravillas was the result of one of those navigation errors that the technology of the era was completely incapable of preventing with the reliability that navigators would have desired. The flagship of the fleet, the Nuestra Señora de la Concepcion, made a calculation error in its position and in the darkness of midnight on January 4 collided directly against the Maravillas. The impact was devastating. The Maravillas, already damaged by the collision, was swept against a reef that completed the destruction of the hull, and in less than 30 minutes the galleon sank, taking 605 of its 650 people aboard with it. Only 45 survived to tell what had happened. It was one of the greatest maritime tragedies of the Spanish colonial era, and the loss of the cargo was an economic blow of considerable proportions even for an empire of Spanish magnitude. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. News of the sinking of the Maravillas reached Spain with the survivors, and the Spanish crown wasted no time organizing rescue expeditions to recover what could be salvaged from the bottom of the Caribbean. In the 17th and 18th centuries, shipwreck rescue expeditions were an established industry in the colonial world, with specialized divers, in many cases indigenous or African slaves forced to work in extremely dangerous conditions, who could descend to depths of several meters to recover the objects and precious metal ingots lying at the bottom. The Maravillas was the subject of multiple recovery expeditions organized by Spanish, English, French, Dutch, American, and Bahamian parties during the 17th and 18th centuries, as Carl Allen, the businessman and founder of Allen Exploration, the organization responsible for the modern expedition that found the treasures now exhibited in the Maritime Museum of the Bahamas, acknowledged. The fact that so many different nations attempted to recover the Maravilla's cargo for so long speaks both to the magnitude of the known wealth it contained and to the difficulty of recovering it completely. Each expedition extracted what it could with the technology available in its era, but the seafloor conditions, the dispersion of remains caused by currents and by successive excavations, and the technical limitations of 17th and 18th century diving equipment guaranteed that something always remained at the bottom. When Allen Exploration arrived at the site with 21st century underwater technology, what they found was proof that 350 years of successive excavations had not exhausted the extraordinary content of the Maravillas. The objects recovered by Allen Exploration and now exhibited in the Maritime Museum of the Bahamas are of a beauty and historical importance that transcends their material value, though that material value is in some cases considerable. One of the most significant findings is a gold pendant with the Cross of Santiago at the center, an object that in the 17th century was much more than a piece of jewelry and was the symbol of membership in one of the most powerful and prestigious institutions of the Hispanic world. The Order of Santiago was the most prestigious military body in Spain and Portugal, a chivalric organization that combined military, religious, and commercial functions and whose members were considered the elite of Iberian society. When Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese navigator who was the first European to sail directly from Europe to India, assumed command of a fleet of 21 ships between 1502 and 1503, he did so accompanied by 8 Knights of the Order of Santiago, which perfectly illustrates the central role this organization played in the great maritime enterprises of the Age of Discoveries. The second gold pendant recovered is even more extraordinary from an artistic and symbolic standpoint. It is an oval object 4.5 centimeters in length whose design concentrates in a tiny space a density of historical and religious meaning that is fascinating to anyone who knows the context in which it was created. At the center of the pendant, the Cross of Santiago protrudes from a large oval-shaped Colombian emerald, a precious stone that in the 17th century was one of the most valued products of the American colonies and reached Europe primarily from the mines of Muzo and Chivor in present-day Colombia. The outer frame of the pendant is adorned with 12 additional emeralds, each representing one of the 12 apostles of Christ, thus combining the Christian religious symbolism with the military symbolism of the Order of Santiago in a piece that perfectly summarizes the profoundly religious and at the same time profoundly martial character of 17th century Spanish culture. The presence of Colombian emeralds in the pendant adds another layer of history to the object. Colombian emeralds were in the 17th century the most valued in the world, superior in quality and size to the emeralds known in Europe before the discovery of America, and their extraction required the forced labor of thousands of indigenous people in brutal conditions. Each emerald that adorned the pendant found in the Maravillas had passed through the hands of indigenous miners in the Colombian mountains, of merchants in Cartagena de Indias, of goldsmiths who mounted them in the gold of the piece, and finally of some knight of the Order of Santiago who carried it with him on the galleon that would sink in the waters of the Bahamas. That chain of human history, connecting the Andean mines with the bottom of the Caribbean and finally with the display cases of the Maritime Museum of the Bahamas, is what converts these pieces into something more than beautiful jewels. Allen Exploration's decision to keep the pieces in the Maritime Museum of the Bahamas rather than dispersing them on the art market or in private collections is a decision that Michael Pateman, director of the museum, valued with a perspective that goes beyond the usual debate about the ownership of underwater treasures. Patman noted that for a nation built from the ocean like the Bahamas, it is extraordinary how little the country's ties to the sea are understood. Few know, for example, that the Lucayan indigenous peoples settled in the Bahamas 1,300 years ago, building an island civilization adapted to the Caribbean environment that existed for centuries before the arrival of Europeans. And few know the tragedy that followed that arrival. The entire Lucayan population, which at its peak numbered almost 50,000 people, was forcibly expelled from its islands, forced to dive for pearls in Venezuela and other Caribbean coasts, and exterminated in less than 3 decades, one of the fastest and most completely documented ethnic extinctions of the colonial era. The Maravillas rests in the waters of islands whose underwater history is extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily little known. Each object recovered from that galleon is a piece of a historical puzzle that includes the grandeur and cruelty of the Spanish Empire, the human drama of the crews who risked their lives crossing the Atlantic, the history of the artisans who created those extraordinary jewels, and the history of the indigenous peoples whose world was destroyed by the same colonial system that produced the riches the Maravillas carried. All of that is in those gold and emerald pendants that today gleam under the lights of the Bahamian Museum, waiting for the visitors who contemplate them to take the time to understand not only their material beauty, but the depth of the history they contain. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.